democracy is a great idea. Is really what that is. It comes from ancient Greece. The word democracy comes from two Greek words, which means rule by the people, and it is something since that time, arguably before, that societies have desired, have reached for, have yearned for. And even in the United States today, we are not technically a democracy. We are democratic. We're a democratic republic. We have democratic tendencies, but we really don't have rule by the people. It's debatable if that's even possible. We would use the word democracy as an adjective. We're democratic. We're not necessarily a democracy. Recent election of 2000, the one candidate got more votes than the guy who became president. But we have representatives who speak for the people. So although we are very democratic in many respects, we just don't fit the category of a democracy, nor did ancient Greece, which they had slaves, comprised probably half the population. Very small amount of groups of people could actually vote in ancient Greece. So democracy is a great idea. It is an idea, it's a system of government where the people rule, yet to be attained, completely, but it is something people like America strives for.
It is a theoretical, idea. So if you go back to Plato, and the Republic, he basically identified, the various forms, of government, and democracy was certainly one. He basically dismissed that one, and he dismissed it because he basically said, well, that's just rule of the ignorant, and that doesn't necessarily work. And he developed his model of the philosopher king. And so where that's sort of like a benevolent dictatorship, if you will, and it's hard for, I don't know that can be, actually achieved, So when you actually look at, what do you mean when you say, democracy in an ideal sense, I think we all have an idea of what an ideal democracy should be, and what's actually in place is not that ideal. It's a representation. It's like an artist thinking of a tree and then painting it. Well, that's one way to get it. There's certainly another way, to get that. And what is the ideal tree? I think an important question is, can we do better than what we've done? Probably so. I don't know what other system is out there. I think democracy is important when it comes to individual rights, things like that. But how it gets implemented in many instances, and the extent to which special interests start to interfere, and all of those sorts of things are basically sort of branches dying on that tree that the artist developed. So I think what we actually end up with is not the ideal at all. And maybe we are striving towards that, but I think different groups that come into political power, through the democratic process, have different impacts on where we end up, and you can see that clearly, through our history.
On some kind of theoretical level, everybody agrees that we mean government for the people, by the people. That's the catchphrase. But practically speaking, I think that when people say democracy is working, they mean it worked for me. So when business says, our great democracy, they mean that it's protecting their financial interests. When movements like activists involved in civil rights or women's issues or these sorts of things, when they say democracy or democracy's working, they mean that they've been able to persuade government to address their particularized issue. So, I think that theoretically people agree, but practically speaking, when you say democracy, usually you're looking at it through a very self-interested lens.
Well, what I would say is America is not a democracy, it's a republic. And that's to say it's a nation of laws. And everyone is expected to live within certain kind of behaviors. It is not just what the majority wants. And that can seem to be a conflict at times, because a lot of people would like things such as, say, prayer in the public schools. And maybe 90% of the people want it, but in a republic we have to protect the 10% to have their freedom not to be coerced by what we would call the tyranny of the majority. So as a republic, It is a democracy in the sense that we do have elections and we have representatives, but it is founded a nation of laws.
One of the differences between America and a democracy simply is that America puts certain limitations on the rule of the majority in the democracy. So America is a liberal democracy as opposed to just a pure democracy, which means that while the majority rules and concludes the minority, the limits to the majority's power are individual rights, and those have to be protected even if it's contrary to the interests of the majority.
You know, purely speaking, democracy is government by the people. That's only been the case in a few handful of situations. I mean, in ancient Greece, when you had a very small population, and frankly, that was not everybody, that was just men, right? but those people, and not slaves, but just, you know, the people who were included in the public debate, they all gathered together and they actually gave public speeches and addressed each other and tried to persuade each other, and then they would vote. So purely speaking, you're talking about kind of what we're used to seeing as a town hall meeting. That's not government today. So practically speaking, when we say democracy, we mean representative institutions. Is that achievable? Sure it is. I think that pure democracy, probably not, but practical democracy in terms of representative institutions, fair and frequent elections, you can try to achieve that, and I think some places have done a pretty darn good job at achieving it.
Is the United States of America a republic or a democracy as far as the form of governing its citizens are concerned? Was the founding fathers of America's sovereign nation, known as the Framers, instituting a government based on a republic standpoint or a democratic standpoint? And what is the difference? Upon critical reading into the history and literature of the Declaration of Independence, Bill of Rights, and Constitution set forth by the Framers, democracy was not a vision. In fact, the Framers believed democracy to be another form of tyranny, a tyranny of mob rule. The founders intended and laid out the ground rules for our nation to be a republic. Not one word of democracy is mentioned in the U.S. Constitution and the Declaration of Independence. In a word or two, the founders knew that democracy would lead to the same kind of mob tyranny the colonies suffered under King George III of Great Britain.
To avoid a democracy was actually one of their main objectives. Again, going back to ancient Greece, and one thing you can say about the founding fathers, the one thing they all shared is they were educated. They were well-read, well-schooled. They studied the classics. They studied ancient Rome and Greece and Egypt, and they understood the political philosophy of Western civilization. And democracy scared them, quite frankly. The idea of the people rule in the 18th century was synonymous with the idea of mob rule. And after the American Revolution, you'll have the French Revolution, this bloody conflict where the mob ruled for several years, and it was ugly. And that was what the founding fathers in this country were fearful of. At the same exact time, they were sick and tired of monarchy, which was ruled by one person. They had been subjected to the horrible rule of the king for centuries, the English were. And what happens in the United States with the founding fathers come upon as a middle ground. a government that is not in one man's power or one army's power, but it's certainly not the opposite, where everyone is equally entitled to vote and do things. And what they come up with the idea of a republic, which they borrowed from Rome, and it was the idea that the people would rule through representatives. And the idea being the representatives were the most educated, the most well-spoken, the most talented. So someone like George Washington, who didn't go to Harvard, didn't quite frankly study much at all compared to the other founding fathers, but he was talented, he was skilled, he married into money, and so he was of the cream of the colonial crop. And Washington, Jefferson, Madison, you could go on, fearful of monarchy, fearful of democracy. A republic was the great middle ground. And that will change over time, but that's what the founding fathers were thinking.
The term republic, we talk about, for instance, the Republican Guarantee Clause of the Constitution, where each state in the Union is guaranteed a Republican form of government. And you often hear today people say that we're a republic and not a democracy. The origin of that term, or that use of the republic as distinguished from pure democracy, actually arises from an invention by one of the founding fathers, James Madison, who writes in Federalist 10 that we have discovered a new science of politics that allows us to make democracy consistent with the interests of protecting individual rights. And so he talks about the two features of American government. One is representation, which he argues refines and enlarges the public view so that you don't simply get the whims or passions of a majority. That helps protect individual rights. And the second thing is also to what he calls the enlargement of the sphere, enlargement of the orbit, in which you have many interests rather than just tightly compacted interests within one place that might have the potential for violating individual rights through the majority will. Now you extend the interest through a sizable country like the United States, and this prevents one single interest from dominating the interests of minority parties.
This was really debated at our founding, right? The Federalists thought that the people were dangerous, that if you gave people too much power, then every time the winds changed, we would have massive overhaul of government. So they instituted representative institutions where we go to the voting booth, we elect a representative to act on our behalf. That representative then goes to DC and participates in the Congress and votes on legislation. That was democratic in the sense that it was to represent the interests of the people. It was not democratic in that it removed government from the people's direct control. And the Federalists thought that we needed statesmen, people who would not be swayed by every fleeting notion. And so they envisioned this rather elitist institution or way of governing, whereby these elites would be elected and they would govern in the interest, for the benefit of the people.
In a democracy, we would have 6 wolves and a lamb voting to decide what we're going to have for dinner. That's the tyranny of the majority.
I think we have a great mixture of both. It was a debate, an argument in our founding between the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists. The Anti-Federalists wanted to protect the common man, the interests of the people. They had a much more positive, idealistic notion of the capacity of people to govern themselves. The Federalists wanted it to be, Republican, small r. They wanted it to be representative government. And if we look at the institutions that we have, they're a combination of both. The Electoral College, which is so contentious these days because of the 2000 election, it is a compromise. We have direct election of our president, but we also have this intermediary institution, the Electoral College, that is representative. So every aspect of our government is a compromise between those two elements, democratic government and Republican government.
On their minds was trying to reconcile democracy with the principle of rights, with the idea of protecting natural rights, because as the Declaration of Independence tells us, the purpose of government is the protection of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. So they tried to structure a constitution, a government, that would protect those individual rights, and their conception of how you do that required institutions of government that could control and limit the majority will. So, for instance, we talk about the separation of powers, executive, legislative, and judiciary. By separating those powers, the goal is to limit the majority in a way that still is consistent with the goals of the regime, which is the protection of individual rights. And also, too, we have other ways of protecting individual rights. For instance, the Bill of Rights that makes clear what those rights are and the obligations of government continually to protect those things.
A constitutional republic is a state where the head of a government and other officials are elected as representatives of the people and must govern according to existing constitutional law that limits the government's power over citizens. In a constitutional republic, executive, legislative, and judicial powers are separated into distinct branches, and the will of the majority of the population is tempered by protections for minority rights so that no individual or group has absolute power. The fact that a constitution exists that limits the government's power makes the state constitutional. That the heads of a government and other officials are chosen by election rather than inheriting their positions, and their decisions are subject to judicial review makes the state republican. Unlike a pure democracy, in a constitutional republic, citizens are not governed by the majority of the people, but by the rule of law. Constitutional republics are a deliberate attempt to diminish the threat of mob rule, thereby protecting minority groups from the tyranny of the majority by placing checks on the power of the majority of the population. The power of the majority of the people is checked by limiting that power to electing representatives who govern within limits of overarching constitutional law rather than popular vote having a legislative power itself. The power of government officials is checked by allowing no single individual to hold executive, legislative, and judicial powers. The executive branch enforces the law, the legislative branch creates the law, and the judicial branch interprets the law. Secession was caused by the coexistence of the southern slave-owning Confederacy states and the increasingly anti-slavery northern Union states. Before Abraham Lincoln seized presidential power, he did not propose federal laws making slavery unlawful, only that one day it would be extinct. Much of the political battle in the 1850s focused on the expansion of slavery and the increasing threat of federal power by the government. Sectional disagreements over the morality of slavery, the scope of democracy, and the economic merits of free labor versus slave plantations caused the Whig parties to collapse and new ones to arise, like the Republican Party in 1854 and the Constitutional Union in 1860. While controversy over the morality of slavery would be contained, it was the issue of the expansion of slavery into the territories that made the conflict irrepressible. Slavery was at the root of economic, moral, and political differences that led to control issues, states' rights, and secession of states. The continued secession of states was a protest against Lincoln's call to invade the South. The states' rights debate cut across the issues. Southerners argued that the federal government was strictly limited and could not abridge the rights of states as reserved in Amendment 10 of the U.S. Constitution, and so had no power to prevent slaves from being carried into new territories.
Number one, people underestimate the impact of the Civil War on American history. While the American Revolution was a landmark thing where, the colonies separated from the imperial power, the Civil War was different. We're talking 600,000 deaths in 4 years. The institution of slavery abolished almost overnight. Civil rights given to African Americans almost overnight. It is a watershed moment, not just in American history, but in world history. And absolutely, one thing that is always forgotten is that there's this economic explosion that the Civil War enables. You typically had, prior to the Civil War, northeastern financial interest advocating industry, urbanization, modernization, capitalism. In the South, although slave owners thought as capitalists do, they were profit seekers, they believed in a more antiquated, what some would call outdated system, agriculture. And boy, the one thing the Civil War enables is this boon towards big business, the railroads, factories, machines. The government is heavily involved in promoting the railroads and industry, tariffs, taxes. And so the Civil War unbelievably changes the South with the abolishment of slavery. But it changes the United States and enables it to become this economic powerhouse that it remains today.
From Abraham Lincoln's Union government of the North's point of view, Southern secession and formation of the Confederacy greatly increased the risk of war prior to the opening of hostilities, and it was regarded as an act of rebellion, treason, and more importantly, the seizure of national territory. Thus, slavery caused secession, which in turn made war likely. Slavery was also irrespective of the North's stated war aims, which at first addressed strategic military concerns as opposed to the ultimate political and constitutional ones. Lincoln's war goals evolved as the war progressed. He did not emphasize national unity during the 1860 election campaign, but brought it to the front in his March 1861 inaugural address, after 7 states had already declared their secession. At first, Abraham Lincoln stressed the Union as a war goal to unite the war Democrats, border states, and Republicans. In 1862, he added emancipation for African American slaves because it permanently removed the divisive issue that caused secession. In his 1863 Gettysburg Address, he tied preserving democracy to emancipation and the Union as a war goal. The Civil War created a powerful federal centralized government where it nurtured its power and produced its bureaucracies.
It all begins 19th century, where much like our military overtures, we're a very aggressive nation. Some would call us an empire. I would call us an empire. And prior to the Civil War, we were incapable of exerting our will around the world. We were a small nation, up and coming, but small, economically deficient, mechanically, infrastructure, everything. The Civil War just enables all of this to change. And without a doubt, the railroads become the real symbol of American industry and modernization. And the railroad industry is part and parcel of the rise of the government after the Civil War. The federal government, after the Civil War, goes from being a tiny non-entity almost. And prior to the Civil War, what the government did was deliver the mail and, negotiate with foreign countries and, talk diplomacy with foreign nations and foreign people, Native Americans included. That was it. Diplomacy and deliver the mail. And then after the Civil War, economically, the federal government's role changes. The number of employees of the federal government begins to change. And by 1900, when America starts embarking on imperialism, going to Hawaii, going to the Philippines, going to Cuba, traveling the world to open markets for American consumer products, to rip raw materials from the earth, fruit and oil and things of that nature. It all is beginning to happen within 50 years, the end of the Civil War. And then and today, the government, big business are partners in this operation, and they will be. They will continue to be.
Actually, about 118 out of our total of 193 countries in the world are democracies. But if you look at the examples in South America, in portions of the Middle East, in Africa, even in some places in Europe, you find democracies, but you don't find. But they are usually described in a rather negative way, and the reason why is you often find them violating the interests and rights of minorities, and so they are referred to often as illiberal democracies. Whereas the goal today seems to be to have liberal democracies, where you do have majority rule, but limitations on the majority in the interests of individual freedom and individual rights. So democracy, simply understood, would not be the best form of government, but rather a government that is institutionally arranged in order to limit the power of government for the sake of individual rights seems to be the optimal type of government. And in some ways, the United States has served as a model to the world. It calls itself a novus ordo seclorum, a new order of the ages, in which it makes its explicit goal institutional designs in government that will allow for those individual rights protections. And that we see less consistently throughout the world today.
As long as we're moving forward in democracy in a very dynamic, changing world, that's what we can do. What democracy would have been in the 19th century is different than what our needs are today. Sure, absolutely, and we should keep working on it, as long as we're not losing sight of things and going in a wrong direction. There can be questions raised at times as to whether we're taking government in a right or wrong direction. It's a constant debate, but in an open society with discussion and the media and all, those issues will come to light. And it's sort of like on an individual. If you start getting off the path a little bit, there's someone to move you back onto the path.
There are definitely certain elements of our system that are not very democratic at all. There are certain sectors of our society that are not represented at all. The homeless. They do not have a voice. The poor don't really have a voice. The youth, meaning college-age students, do not have a voice. Social Security is being protected. We are not revamping that program in any major way. Why? Because the elderly have a voice. So ultimately, young employers, young employees who are paying into a system are going to find themselves 50, 75 years down the road in a heap load of mess. Regardless of how you think we should solve the problem, it is a problem. And if we don't address it, it's because the elderly have a voice and the young generation does not.
I think ultimately we're working in the proper direction, but if we're not working in the proper direction, America will cease to be a significant power at some point. It might take a century. I don't think that will happen. But if indeed people do not have an entrepreneurial spirit, do not want to be productive people, and are happy just being stimulated and numbed out and be stupid and entertained, yeah, America will lose out.
Political philosophers are really all over the map on this one. And I think a lot of it has to do with their historical context. You know, if we see some of our ancient philosophers who had either, you know, the excesses of Greek democracy or the excesses of Roman emperors, they will demonize that system and say, you know, that doesn't work, we need the opposite. We see that also in response to the glorious revolution in England during the Enlightenment. You know, we had a monarchy that had been in power for forever and had become corrupt. And in response, we get Locke and Rousseau and some of these people who want the people to take back control over their government. So you have to really read philosophy with that in mind. Similarly, you have Marx. Marx sees, you know, the Enlightenment and the Industrial Revolution leading to the excesses of capitalism, and he really says, you know, markets are integrally tied to governmental systems, and it's not just enough to say on the face you have democracy if your economic structure is really building a kind of class system. So they differ on what they prescribe, and I think a lot of it has to be taken within their political context.
There's one line of argument that suggests that big government is inconsistent with the intentions of the framers because it is inconsistent with the goal of protecting individual rights and guaranteeing individual freedom. I'm not sure that I see in the American founding a hostility to the idea of big government. Mostly if you look at thoughtful people like Alexander Hamilton, James Madison, and others, they anticipated that government would have to engage in a great deal of detailed regulation to guarantee free commercial exchange, to guarantee the protection of individual rights. So it doesn't seem to me that it's necessarily, big government is necessarily inconsistent with individual freedom. But it is true that the problem of big government is that government becomes more complex than any average individual citizen can understand. And that's a problem in democracies, because if democracy essentially relies on the participation of the people, but government is too complex for them to understand, then there is a growing departure between the conduct of government and the democratic goals of the regime.
Well, the government has legitimate functions to perform. They need people, they need resources to get those things done. So any good citizen understands they have an obligation to pay their fair share of taxes. Not a doubt of that at all. And I don't think many people would argue with the need to pay taxes. The question is whether taxes are fair. There is an argument today that would suggest that the tax breaks that have occurred in recent years are essentially designed to aid the people that are the very highest income levels. There's some question of fairness that would come into that.
Income and wealth are really two different things, and wealth over time has become concentrated. And to the extent that now in an economy, when you can vote for the production of things with dollars, those that have the most dollars get the most votes. Unlike the political democratic process where it's one person, one vote, the more dollars you have, the more economic votes you get in terms of what gets produced. And so you see our economy producing luxury yachts, rather than affordable homes.
I think that government and economics are tied at the hip because a people chooses their government and chooses their economy to be philosophically compatible. So, we always point to capitalism and democracy and communism as the two polar opposite kind of political and socioeconomic structures. So in some sense they are absolutely tied. However, practically speaking, how involved is government in our economy? That's changed over the course of our history. We've gone from being far more capitalistic to far less capitalistic. And I think that the real turning point was the 1930s, the Great Depression, when our economic system collapsed, and Franklin Delano Roosevelt really kind of introduced government mechanisms into the economy to stabilize it. And today we still see kind of that legacy. For example, September 11th, in response, the airlines, now they were already struggling, but they really hit rock bottom because nobody was flying. And the government actually went in and subsidized the airlines to help them out. So, we have seen far more government intervention in our free market society than previous generations.
When we start looking at the welfare state, we've got to look at it on both ends of the scale. We have a welfare state to an extent for the poor people, which we've been kind of working on to address the fact that we want you to get out of that state, to be learning skills, get education so that you're not on welfare, and if you're on welfare that you would work to become a productive citizen. But really at this stage the welfare is as much or more the issue of corporate welfare, where through lobbyists and other persons of influence basically give an advantage to the corporate persons and help them to grow very, very wealthy through the power and influence that they have on government.
How do you decide, who you're going to take from and who you're going to give to, and that actually is an ideological, a philosophical question, because when it comes right down to it, that the Marxian solution was from each according to his ability to each according to his need, and recognizing that people had different skills and that so there needed to be some sort of distributional effect. In the U.S., the distribution is definitely not very symmetrical.
Well, the bottom line is, of course, you can't consume more than you produce. And that's true as an individual, and it's true for a nation. And certainly we are getting very, very close to the point that our national debt is going to become a serious problem. Ben Bernanke of the Fed is essentially saying, especially as we get these entitlements of Social Security for the baby boomers, that we're not going to be able to afford it. And just like an individual who spends more than they produce, sooner or later the chickens come home to roost. And so ultimately, if the government is doing something, they should pay for it. There should be a balanced budget.
I think a lot of government intervention has happened under the Commerce Clause of the Constitution. And we see throughout the 20th century the Commerce Clause being utilized by the Congress to achieve a number of things. Particularly, we see it being used to regulate businesses to forward civil rights. So Congress almost says, capitalism gone awry can ultimately really trample on the rights of the individual. An economic system that really feeds greed and self-interest ultimately leaves those really without. So, I think that civil rights is a great case in point of Congress or government's intervention in the economy. And, I also look around at programs that we have since the 1930s, the 1960s, like Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid. Those are social welfare programs. In a pure capitalistic system, there'd be no room for social welfare, right? So definitely these programs have been to curb the excesses of capitalism and to really provide the security net so that our have-nots don't have so little.
And in business, Toyota's objective is to drive General Motors out of business. General Motors' objective, likewise, is to drive Toyota out of business. Fine, but we play fair.
Capitalism is only one way to organize economic activity. As a matter of fact, in economics, we have a whole course in comparative economic systems where you look at alternative ways of organizing economic activity. Obviously, the Chinese under Chairman Mao, had a way to do it. The Soviets, had a way to do it. And there was a huge debate between the Austrian school and then the school that was leaning more towards socialism, and the idea was, individuals and whether or not that generated individual choice and whether or not that generated a good solution for the economy as a whole versus a planned economy. With modern, back in the 30s, 40s, prior to the computer revolution and the information revolution, it really wasn't possible, for a planned society to work well because of the sheer volume of decisions that had to get made in terms of having a particular quantity of supply one place, and given matching demand, there were all sorts of mismatches and overproduction and underproduction, etc. Nowadays, it's a bit easier to do that with modern information technology. So it might be time to revisit that debate. And that idea of individual liberty, I think, is an important one. I think we all basically can identify with the fact that we like our individual freedom. But we like it to the extent that it doesn't hurt someone else, and to the extent that it basically creates good things for the society as a whole. And there are many social problems today that that the economic system, capitalism as one. So when you look at capitalism, it needs to be managed, and that management process is what we, I think, do, on the political side. I think when you say democracy, you're talking politics, so pretty much. And so we attempt to manage it that way. But then that process, as you well know, is a voting one. When you look at, a citizen participation in the voting process, it makes you wonder if it's actually representative of the population. So the outcomes that end up moving forward, may not well be, really representative. It's representative of those that choose to vote. And so there's a lot of apathy out there, people that just are sort of going with the wind, if you will. So as a way of, back to your question, as a way of organizing economic activity, sure, capitalism works. The U.S. has been very successful here in the short run. But whether or not it's sustainable and whether or not, it will be successful in the long run, I don't know. Rome was successful for longer than we've been. And there are, a lot of issues, that need to be resolved politically. And up to this point, I see more strife than consensus building, in the political process.
And you know, it's interesting. I always tell students it doesn't have to be like that. Like, there's a tendency to think that capitalism and democracy are one and the same. They coincidentally grew together. They both are born in the West. They're born in the 18th century. The American Republican experiment, the democratic experiment, grows alongside capitalism. So there is a tendency to think the two are directly connected, but in fact they're not. It turns out that way in this country, but for example, in the Soviet Union, when the Soviet Union was founded, with Lenin and the Russian Revolution, early 20th century, there were many Russian people who promoted democracy. Part of their socialist revolution, anti-capitalist revolution, was to spread economic power to the same people they wanted to spread political power. And it's the greatest example we have where socialism can work with democracy. So the two issues, democracy, capitalism, are very often synonymous, but they don't have to be. It's just sort of accidentally the way it's worked out in this country. And I'll tell you, over time, people in this country have wanted two things, sometimes one more than the other: political rights and economic rights. And you could argue today that while many people have the right to vote, it's easy to get the right to vote in this country, but getting, property and education, good health care, that's becoming very, very difficult. So they're not always the same thing.
Exactly. Does capitalism harmoniously work together with democracy? Capitalism gives a starker view of the world than any other economical system. And individuals, the noun, and the things and even people around them are all objects. Central questions that are raised are: what can a person pick, produce, mine, farm, distribute, manufacture, sell? Who can that person employ, buy from, sell to, sell, convince, exploit? Capitalism limits the democracy, the majority of the moment, to its only useful purpose, the electing of various individuals to various positions of public office. Other than this limited aspect, the power of the majority is severely limited. Capitalism in this sense only supports a limited democracy, but not a pure one. Under capitalism, no individual nor any group of individuals, whether they be minority or majority, can violate the inalienable rights of any other minority, including the most oppressed minority that has ever existed, the individual. In the sense commonly used, that democracy means egalitarianism, the equality of results, by an unequal protection of rights. Capitalism is entirely opposed to it. In making decisions, corporate board members to small-time business owners work with the legality of things and usually dismiss the ethicality of them.
When it comes right down to it, the pursuit of self-interest in many instances doesn't necessarily do what's right for the whole. Now Adam Smith in his laissez-faire, invisible hand, suggested that if we all pursue our self-interest, then that's going to be the best thing for society, but that's not always the case. And that's where a government has a major influence. For example, in production with external effects like pollution. It's in the self-interest of a company to transfer those costs onto society, because then they're more profitable. They're not incurring the cost of cleaning up the things that they're putting into the environment. And it's necessary for a government to basically oversee the process and ensure that they basically do incur those costs and not impose them on the rest of society. So there are a lot of instances. That's just one example. There are so many examples, that it's important for a government to actually sort of, to oversee, the consequences of economic activity that are driven by individual self-interest. So that has to get balanced.
Oh, it's a perfect match. It's exactly what it's all about. This is the nation of laws. Capitalism is predicated upon value, the creation of value. And when you create value, ultimately everyone is going to come out better. And that's the freedom to be the very best you can be and earn the results of it. That you have the result to become a millionaire, because you earn it. not because someone hands it to you, not because you get it out of influence. But I would say capitalism has to be predicated upon democracy, and more specifically a republic. And people got to play fair on that. You cannot use capitalism as something which uses the government to get undue advantage, so we create the Enrons of the world. But when we do get the Enrons of the world, we make the corrections, and we take those people and put them in jail. Same thing, we've got to have property rights. That's the right of individual ownership, and ownership being earned. And that's the American dream, is to get a home for yourself, to be able to build that for your family, to have a business of your own and build it. But you got to own it. And that is the thing for a lot of these countries that don't respect individual property rights. So without democracy and a nation of laws, there won't be investment, and without investment, no value will be created, and without that, the citizens will not have a very good standard of living.
On the one hand, capitalism is not is not simply an ally of democracy, because democracy does anticipate that in order to have majority rule, you need to have a sort of what you might call a relative egalitarianism, or as Alexis de Tocqueville would call it, equality of conditions. And in that sense, if capitalism leads to tense relations between classes, that is, against the few and the many, then in that way they tend to be rivals. On the other hand, capitalism is not utterly inconsistent with democracy, because capitalism also does provide for individual opportunities. Each individual theoretically should be able to acquire a sufficient amount of capital to be able to make some investment in a capitalist economy. And so in some ways you find often democracies do have capitalism, because they can be complementary. So it's neither one. And therefore it's always a constant challenge for capitalistic countries to have an economy that simultaneously complements the goals of democracy.
But we don't really have a free market capitalistic society here in the U.S. We have sort of a form of monopoly capitalism. We don't really have markets allocating resources, because companies have market power. We have large, big business, we call them oligopolies, near monopolies, in a lot of industries here in the United States. We've concentrated capital into very large pools, and that capital, is been able to collect, larger than a share of the resources that they should have. That's monopoly capitalism, and to an extent, the political process contributes to that through policy making. For example, allowing mergers between companies that compete. Once you allow two companies that were competitors, and that downward pressure on prices to consumers from that competition to go away, they combine into one company, they're no longer competing. That basically is higher prices, which is good for the company, not good for the society as a whole. Good for the company shareholders, but not good for the people, if you will.
Democracy is a consensual hallucination of people concerned with how to divide opportunity fairly. But the substantive corrupts the procedural, when the love of things corrupts the spirit of fairness. Some problems claimed to be associated with capitalism include unfair and inefficient distribution of wealth and power, a tendency toward market monopoly or oligopoly, and government by oligarchy, imperialism, debt, globalization, various forms of economic exploitation, and phenomena such as social alienation, inequality, unemployment, and economic instability. Common phrases like, "It's only business," "It's the American dream," "Tough love," "Better luck next time," "You're on your own," and "Business is business" are usually coined. Morality in business is not merely a matter of refraining from committing fraud or theft. Compliance with laws and living according to a moral light are entirely different matters. What our businessmen think, what our business schools teach, and what society unthinkingly accepts, that each of us is licensed to chase the dollar without regard for anything except the laws. And you're taught that humans are supposed to be rational wealth accumulators, each acting as an individual to maximize his own wealth in the market. Capitalism is a system in which the central institutions of society are in principle under autocratic control. Thus, a corporation or an industry is, if we were to think of it in political terms, has tight control at the top and strict obedience has to be established at every level. The coming phases of the industrial economy were to be socialized, with eventual profits privatized, a form of state socialism for the rich on which much of the advanced U.S. economy relies.
I think really the big thing, and it's not only my opinion, but I think just even the news itself, for its ethical reporting, and that's bias, with regards to ownership. And it happened to be that the ownership also owns GE, which is making billions of dollars with military contracts. So that just alone, that just model set just kind of shows you that one, agenda, what's the agenda? Who owns the ownership as far as the media, especially with vertical and horizontal integration. Interesting dynamics. Ownership and bias, agenda setting, I think is our biggest problem.
The problem with media in America is a sheer tragedy on democracy in a society of unprecedented technological, industrial, and intellectual power. Today, pontificating commentary where celebrity personalities wrangle back and forth on popular opinions with news hooks have taken over investigative journalism. Agenda-setting bias upon commonly held viewpoints have replaced objective voices for critical debate, and key documentary reporting have been replaced with sensationalized, desynthesized entertainment appeals and storylines. All of these and many tribulations to mass media communications have been shunned by the corporate interests of owners that have overtaken and own large media outlets. Democracy, in its most explicit form, demands the right to know on all key and minor issues, an accepted avenue of public opinion, the establishment of free speech and press, the platform to hear opposing voices, and the elimination of anything of private affairs to be established as public affairs. This is all to be accomplished even if it requires a state-instituted, non-profit, and non-commercial media sector where advertising and commercialism are discouraged, if not eliminated. Yet sound bites, consumer products, and numerous propaganda tools have intertwined with pressures of high ratings, bottom line profits, and shareholder value has smeared democracy in the face and avenue of the media.
I always ask my students, in mass comm, who decides what news is? And who decides what news is and what entertainment is? Why sometimes a headliner in a newspaper in Denver has one item that might be a local reference, and then Pensacola, Florida, or Tallahassee, or Tampa has another. So there's always a question of who decides what news is. And I think for a long time we have thought that we'll tell the news what's important. Is it a reflection of us as a society, or sometimes are we being told how we are? And I think there might be a difference in what the perceived reality is and how things really are. It's perceived that they're very they're kind of right of center, and I think that whole debate on what media is, the use of broadcast media today, is kind of defining positions. And I think as an audience, as Americans, sometimes we listen as a third party instead of interacting and then defining what democracy is. We tend to kind of be a third party, and we listen to the spin doctors debate and how they interpret it to be. There just seems to be, over these last few years, there's a tendency with voices to put names to it. The liberal left, the left, conservative. O'Reilly came up with a book called Culture Warrior. He's got these little names for people. There's this tendency to kind of move everybody back to center. When they're, when perhaps if they're left, very liberal to conservative. So there's always this kind of balance point. And I think you see it on the spin doctors and the talk shows, is that it's interesting, we have a democracy, but sometimes the perceptions of people who have different voices and different ideas are kind of looked upon as kind of nomads and rebels, and perhaps kind of put in a box, with a name on it.
Upon the scale of corporate capitalism and explicit government-granted and government-enforced monopoly rights, the media has become a source of privatized wealth for owners and shareholder value, where measures to maximize profits have denigrated intellectual news, critical reporting, and effective journalism. Today, the public relations and advertising industry have worked with media outlets to propagate hyper-commercialism, biased news reporting, and a machine of propaganda raking in the hundreds of billions of dollars, all for the success of controlling the American society and empowering wealthy elite statuses. The crisis of the media can only lead to numerous problems than a failed democratic state. It can lead to depoliticization of citizenry, apathy on political and economical issues, rapid appeal for profits in entertainment and corporate industries, corruption of political leaders, a failed electoral system, an uninformed nation, and a desolate future.
If you really think about our today's world, in 2007, we have so much information overload. We have information overload today. I mean, it's on TV, and you'll watch a TV screen, and in the upper right-hand corner will be a banner coming up. There's about 6 or 7 messages right now. And what's happened is, I think, we're oversensitized with the information. Getting back to propaganda, I think if the message, there seems to be a kind of a tick, 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 a constant repetitive messages to the audience over time. Why, as an example, why some stories never go away. After a while, Americans will say, well, when's enough enough? And I think sometimes that connection of when we as an audience say, hey, we've had enough of that, versus the media saying, well, we'll tell you, audience, when you've had enough of it. Honestly, I kind of grew up, with the 60 Minutes thing, and the Dan Rather, investigative reporting. Oh my goodness, if you ever seen the 60-minute crew come on in there, you're in trouble thing. And then later on, with Aldo Rivera, with regards to Geraldo at large. I think it's a great thing. I think it keeps the problems that are brought to the surface that perhaps us as Americans would have never known about. I mean, look at the Watergate with regards to the investigative reporting. A few journalists there, took down the president. But, in my opinion, they may be calling it investigative reporting today, but it's got to the point where it's almost sensationalism. It's almost entertainment. Look at the shows, E.T., Entertainment Tonight, and I mean little short snippets of facts, but from the standpoint, it's more sensationalism and entertainment, than it is, pure investigative reporting.
Probably the institution that we have today, that the Founding Fathers did not desire, is a mediating institution. That's political parties. Political parties are very democratic in the sense that they organize interests and petition government. So in a way, parties are the excesses of democracy woven into our government, because Madison in Federalist 10 said, beware of majority factions. If democracy gets a stronghold, if interests are able to get a hold of government in the form of a majority, they can completely trample on minority rights. This was his fear. Now, he didn't envision minority like we envision today, of course, but nonetheless, I think he'd look at a two-party system where any given election determines party control of government, and thus our entire legislative agenda. He would be frightened of that. He would think that that's democracy gone wild. On the other hand, can Republican elements also not be good or go to an extreme? I think that the 2000 election is a case in point. When your representative institutions no longer reflect your popular demands, and there is widespread dissatisfaction because of it, or feelings of disenfranchisement, alienation, lack of political efficacy, then I think that, again, you have one element dominating another.
The constant frustration with American politics is that you see an issue that that a large percentage of the population is immediately concerned with, and yet there seems to be a lack of action that's consistent with that enthusiasm from the population. And that's always been a feature of American politics, and it's nothing new today. It's been throughout our history. I think the question is how to assess that. Sometimes it's from the lack of sufficient ideas among political leaders, which I think is often illustrated, for instance, in the case of campaign finance reform. Take, for example, everyone seems to be for campaign finance reform, but there never seems to be a reform that really satisfies people. Well, part of the problem is that the aspiration of campaign finance reform is for what we might call genuinely democratic elections that do not seem to be tainted by any interests, especially corporate interests, or any special interests. The problem with that aspiration is that in some ways politics is always about special interests. All of us have interests, and we consider our interests to be special, and so therefore in some politics can never entirely get away from special interests. So on the one hand we want perfectly democratic elections that involve no special interests. On the other hand, politics seems to be essentially about special interests. So when politicians make promises to reform, say, campaign finance, right, and restore democratic elections, sometimes the problem is that they make promises that really are not based on a thoughtful assessment of the current character of American politics.
In other words, so who's basically contributing to getting elected, and I think that is unfortunate. And I think people see that there's been a lot of election reform discussed, in terms of campaigns, what's allowable, what's not. So there's a huge legal process, to talk about, just what it is that you bring up. But I'm afraid, that any political candidate has been captured. And I would argue that once they're in power, then they reward the people that supported them. I think you can see that right now. And in terms of, if you look at who's been benefiting, who's not. I've even heard that you can basically look at federal distribution to the states and explain a bit of that by red state, blue state.
I would certainly like to believe that every person in our government believes that they are acting in the best interest of the American people. And I can't believe there are too many people who are politicians that don't really believe that, though they may see it differently than someone else, which brings us back down to the nation of laws and the Constitution. And as long as we are dealing within a nation of laws and the Constitution, I believe we can work those things out. But yes, there's not a question that there have been some problems developed with lobbyists and special interests and the people in Congress living high on the hog. America's getting fat and lazy. And we're going to have to address that. And hopefully we will address it.
Well, that's certainly always possible that your representatives may be more interested in their personal interests than the interest of their constituents. In fact, the founders, the American founders, would have thought that you should always be suspicious of human beings because human nature tends towards self-interest, and as they always said, we're poor judges in our own cases. So in some ways, it has always been understood in American politics that our representatives can have interests that are at odds with the service that we expect from them as guardians of the interests of the people. On the other hand, we do also have ways of making sure that our representatives act within our own interests. That includes biennial elections in the House. We have elections every 6 years in the Senate, every 4 years for the President. And so in this way we try to take advantage of the benefits that come from representation, that is having people of distinguished merit contribute to the conduct of our government. But on the other hand, we want to make sure that they consistently remain within the interests of the people, and that means subjecting them to regular elections.
What we end up doing is, it's a business supports a candidate, and then that candidate, in turn, does things for business. Oh, let's relax the clean air standards, so that the power companies, don't have to spend so much. So let's relax the water standards. Let's not join the Kyoto Protocol, with respect to carbon emissions for global warming, because that would impose costs on companies. So all of those sorts of things, are really serving business. But at this point, I think that the political process, has moved towards, favoring business at the expense of the people who were, in essence, elected. So rather than the administration, representing the people, they're representing the special interest groups that put them in power. And a lot of Washington is driven by special interest groups. The lobby process, and a lot of money gets allocated, in that. That's not part of the market. And that's, I think, wrong.
More than anything else in my American government class, I try to instill in my students an appreciation for, even if they hate it, even if they hate government, an appreciation for how it affects their lives. And an understanding that every election cycle they have an opportunity to express their voice. They might not get the outcome they desire, but eventually they will. And I make that point about Social Security and the role of the elderly in American politics. And the truth of the matter is, if you don't say anything, if you don't exercise your right as a citizen of this country, you have no right to complain. Voting is not mandatory, and I don't think it should be. I don't have a problem with the groups who practice their right enjoying more benefits out of our system than those who don't practice it. It's kind of the consequence. And when is a better time to practice your right to vote? Midterm elections, nobody votes. Special elections are even worse. And that's really shocking. A couple hundred people determined the presidential election in 2000. So every vote counts, and young people, if they really organize themselves, could really make a difference.
In a national society that has a large large, vested middle class like the United States of America, there will be no initiative or action for change. It is because the middle class of America are not facing an immediate or present threat to their livelihood nor survival that the willingness to improve political and socio-economical structures will go unhindered. And it is because of this effect, lethargy, indifference, and even laziness is put into place when it comes to issues of political, social, and economical focus. Apathy begins to breed from the concept and philosophy of inaction. However, when a political structural rule of a country begins to divide its nation among the rich and the poor, the elite and the disenfranchised, the informed and the uninformed, the powerful and the exploited, and the rulers and the ruled, cynicism and depoliticization goes into effect.
When people criticize apathy and praise activism, they give you the impression that if citizens took a greater interest in government, everything would be more democratic. And that if you're an activist, you'll make substantial changes in government. I wouldn't be that optimistic. I think those things are good. They can be helpful in the conduct of government. But also too, one has to remember that there are limits to majority rule in the protection of individual rights. The real problem with apathy is that when citizens begin to think that government no longer rests on the consent of government, on the governed, then the very moral foundation of American government is challenged. Because then we believe that our membership in America is merely a matter of accident, and that it's a matter of irrelevance whether or not we consent to government. And that is a formula, from the founders' perspective, that's the formula for tyranny. When you no longer believe that government requires the consent of the governed in order to establish its just powers. So that is a serious issue, and apathy in that sense can be very bad and very dangerous for the future of government.
Apathy is a debilitating disease that is caught loosely and becomes very contagious. There's no known cure, no remedy for apathy. However, there is therapy for apathy, and that is education. Symptoms of apathy are constant complaining with no hindsight for change, inaction to its largest extent, silence when it comes to political, economical, and cultural debate, illusions of creative euphemisms, pessimism without any solutions, and cynicism with no end. Apathy is a disease that needs to be excised, and for liberation, movement, and revolution is to begin.
But I would say it is very, very difficult for one person to make that much of a difference. Having said that, what do you want to do? You want to light a single candle or curse the darkness? But the other side, the question I said to sales management this morning, have you had enough of where these old white men have taken this country? Are you ready to take back America? So what are you going to do about it?